we get to hear from one of our colleagues, somebody that inspires us, somebody that offers us education, learning, something exciting to take home from here other than the haiku poem that we're all going to purchase. So it is an honor and a privilege to, first of all, acknowledge Upala. Now, I've practiced this, so Chandrasekhara, as one of our recipients of the 2018 Inspiring Leader Awards. So it is my pleasure to introduce her. I had the great honor of speaking with her briefly before we started here, and you know, it's great to Google, right? We find some interesting things when we Google sometimes, and so she really has done some fabulous things for this community, for this country, locally, provincially, nationally. She completed her MSW at Wilfrid Laurier. I didn't tell you, we're alumni together, so. Where she already contributed substantially to the mental health field as a student. So she is one of the authors of a guide, it's called Best Practice Guidelines for Mental Health Promotion Programs, and this was specifically for refugees. And that's available online, by the way. She has had an amazing career. She's worked tirelessly to advocate on behalf of marginalized populations. A major focus of her work has been with the intersection of discrimination and racism on health, mental health, and social well-being. To list a few of her positions currently, she is a mom. That's a very important position. She is also the Director of Public Policy at the Canadian Mental Health Association, where she's been for quite some time. She co-chairs Ontario Police Hospital Transition Task Force. Since 2012, she has served on the Board of Directors of the Mental Health Commission of Canada. Notably, in 2017, she was the first ever mental health expert and social worker, maybe not first social worker, but mental health expert, appointed by the Ontario Cabinet to the Toronto Police Services Board. In her spare time, she's an active volunteer, and one of the things she has been recognized for by University of Toronto's Factor in Wentesh Faculty of Social Work is the Outstanding Alumni Mentor Award, where she has mentored alumni from the social work program there. She is certainly a most deserving recipient of this award this year, and we are so fortunate to have her as our keynote speaker today. So thank you. Thank you for coming, and I'm looking very forward to your presentation.
Well, first, let me just say thank you so much. And I just love being a social worker. Being a social worker is a huge part of my identity, and to be recognized by all of you and the association in this way means just so much to me. So thank you. And thank you all for coming to this event and to hear me speak. I also want to thank someone, Steve Lurie, who is a social worker, and he's a colleague and a friend and a mentor of mine. He's the one who nominated me for this award. I've worked with Steve for almost a decade. Perhaps some of you know him, nodding heads. Anyone know him? Yeah. I call him the great granddaddy of mental health because he has been a tireless advocate for mental health for over 30 years, and he has such a wealth of knowledge. And he's an inspiration to me and to many of us who work in mental health, so I really want to honor him and thank him as well. So today, when I got this invitation to speak, I was so excited because I rarely get an opportunity to speak to an audience of social workers who intimately understand the impact of mental health. A lot of the work that I do is in the criminal justice system. So I do a lot of work with police, with lawyers, with other justice professionals. And my journey to social work actually began in the justice world. So about, I would say, 16, 17 years ago, I was a correctional officer. And I worked with youth in a secure custody facility up in Iqaluit. Anyone here been to Iqaluit? Yeah? We'll have to share stories later. Anyone else? So Iqaluit is the capital of Nunavut, and it's up on Baffin Island. And when I was living there, it's such a beautiful place for anyone who's never been. It's full of beautiful people, they're generous and kind, but it's also a place that faces a lot of systemic inequities. And when I was working up there, that was my first close encounter with mental health and addictions issues. So I was working as a CO, and on my days off, I worked as a security guard in the local RCMP detachment. And back then, there were very little psychiatric supports available up in Iqaluit. So what would happen is if someone was experiencing a mental health crisis, they would call 911, and the RCMP would show up, apprehend the person, and bring them to a holding cell. And my job as security guard was to watch that person overnight to make sure they weren't harming themselves. And in the morning, if that person was feeling better, we would just release them into the community. There's no follow-up, no support, nothing. We just let them go. And because of these systemic inequities, because of the lack of resources up there, we were relying on police in their role as emergency responders to be the response for people in crisis. And think about that. We as a society were asking police officers to intervene in mental health crisis situations when that's not their job. Their job is public safety, right? So if we think about it even further, this is a larger societal issue. We have legislation, the Mental Health Act, that governs people with mental health issues and their symptoms. Think about that, right? Do we have legislation that governs symptoms of heart disease or diabetes? No. But we have ways in governing people with mental health and addictions issues. So those early experiences that I gained, they've stayed with me, and they inform a lot of the work that I do now. So today, what I'm hoping is to talk to you about some systemic inequities and how we as social workers can intervene, can support, and how we can help. A lot of what I'm going to say is going to be very familiar to you. You're the mental health experts, you know this stuff. But some of the stuff I will say, I hope is new information for you. These are some things that I've learned on my journey in the social work field. So thank you. A little bit about where I work, the Canadian Mental Health Association. Anyone here from CMHA? Nobody. Everyone know about CMHA? Oh, good. Thank goodness. We have a lot of people who think CMHA is CAMH. And just to clarify, CAMH is the psychiatric hospital in Toronto. CMHA, the Canadian Mental Health Association, we're the largest community-based mental health and addictions provider in the country. We have over 100 locations coast to coast. And we are Canada's oldest health charity, and we're celebrating 100 years this year. So it's amazing. And in Ontario, we have 30 locations, and I work for Ontario Division, and our primary focus is public policy, education, and health promotion. This is an ad campaign that we used for several years. Perhaps you've seen it in the subway or in the buses. And I'll read it to you. It said, "Mental illness, just another excuse for bad behavior." According to the Canadian Medical Association, 46% of Canadians think that mental illnesses offer an excuse for poor behavior and personal failings. They assume that people with mental illnesses have a choice, and if they just tried hard enough, they could snap out of it. This is a ransom note, and it reads, "We have your son. He's completely overwhelmed in a crippling maze of darkness and unshakable sadness. Do nothing and see what happens." And it's signed by depression. According to that CMA survey, 11% of Canadians think that depression is not a mental illness, and 50% think that it's not a serious condition. The CMA also found that 1 in 4 Canadians admitted that they would be fearful to be around someone with a serious mental illness. And that fear is at the core of the stigma around mental health. So several years ago, we looked closely at CMHA Ontario at the links between violence and mental health issues. And we looked at studies from Canada and the United States. And what we found is, I'm sure many of you have done this work as well, is that estimating the rate of violent behavior is not easy. It's very complex, and there is no definitive causal relationship between violence and mental health issues. What we found is that people with serious mental illnesses are actually more likely to be the victims of violence than perpetrators. But that's not what we see in the media, and that's not what we see in reporting. If you're interested to learn more about it, there's a link for you here. I really encourage you to check it out. So here, yeah.
I'm sorry, could I just ask you to move your mic? I'm having troubles right here, so I'm sure some people are. Thank you. Thank you.
Is that better? Yeah.
You almost have to be in front of it.
How is that? Is that better? Yeah? Okay. So here are the stats. We all know this, right? 1 in 3 Canadians will experience a mental health issue within their lifetime, and in a given year it's 1 in 5. Suicide is the leading cause of non-accidental death for young Canadians, and for older adults, more than 40% of them experience a mental health issue. 500,000 people didn't go to work today because of a mental health issue. And let's look at addiction as well. Over 20% of Canadians will meet the criteria for addiction within their lifetime. And in Ontario, approximately 10% of people have a substance misuse issue. And we all are very familiar with the ongoing opioid crisis, right? So in Ontario, there's approximately an opioid-related overdose death every 10 hours. And that is from 2016 stats. And I know that the 2017 stats are a lot more dire, and it's much higher now. There's also an economic cost to mental health in Canada. The Mental Health Commission of Canada a few years ago looked at the economic costs, and what they found is that it is an estimated $50 billion a year. And the cost to businesses alone in 2011 was $6 billion in lost productivity. I think we're all familiar with the term absenteeism, right? But there's also presenteeism, which is when you show up to work and you're not really there. Over 20% of the working population experience mental health conditions. And if unaddressed, the Mental Health Commission estimates that this will cost $198 billion over the next 30 years. I'm not going to go into defining mental health addictions, you all know that. I think what's important is that we think about the spectrum, right? We know that it's possible to have positive mental health despite a diagnosis of an illness. We also know that you may never be diagnosed at all and have very poor mental health. Same thing with addiction, it's a spectrum. There's beneficial use, there's casual use, there's problematic use, and then there's chronic dependence. And where we fall on these two spectrums, it all depends on what's going on in our life at that moment, right? Life stressors, this is a big piece of the work that we do as social workers. We saw it in the video too,
Is there
right?
any way you can speak a little louder? We're still struggling to hear you.
Sure. Okay.
Project. Loud. Low.
All right. How's that? Louder? Okay, good. I wish I had a poem for this awkward moment. So life stressors, we know that the negative life events impact our health, right? Death, divorce, loss of job. We also know the positive life events impact our health. Things like marriage, getting a new job, starting a new career, all of that. And we also know that social determinants impact our health. So what we say at CMHA all the time is that in order to have positive mental health, all you need is a home, a job, and a friend. And we're really talking about the social and economic conditions that impact our lives. So here are a lot of the social determinants that we focus on as Canadians, right? The piece I really want to focus on today is the piece around discrimination and equity and how that impacts our mental health and well-being. I love showing this picture because it depicts it all. So at the top, we have the person who has access to employment, income, and education, and they're racing to their health. And the person on the bottom, they're bogged down by social, economic, and political marginalization, and their journey to health is a lot more challenging. And we know this because we see the impact, the differential impacts in health outcomes as a result of marginalization. We know that women are 2 times more likely to have depression than men. We know that LGBTQ youth are 4 times at risk of suicide than their hetero peers. We also know that young Indigenous women are 21 times more likely to be at suicide risk than non-Indigenous women. And a lot of this is tied into stigma and discrimination, right? Which is rooted in misperceptions. The way I differentiate stigma from discrimination, stigma is a negative attitude, a stereotype, and discrimination is the action that results from that negative attitude and stereotype. I want to take a few minutes and really think about the impact of racism on our health, because this is widespreading and more research is being done on this. There isn't a universal definition of racism, but I want to offer this one. When I was a student, I had the privilege of studying with Dr. George Day. He is an anti-racism scholar, an activist, and he teaches at the University of Toronto. This is his definition. Racism is racial and cultural prejudice and discrimination supported intentionally or unintentionally by institutional power and authority, used to the advantage of one race and the disadvantage of other races. The critical element that differentiates racism from prejudice and discrimination is the use of institutional power and authority to support prejudices and enforce discriminatory behaviors in systemic ways with far-reaching outcomes and effects. I think this definition is really useful because it hits at the heart of the issue with this, which is that racism is embedded into our structures, into our legislation, into the fabric of our society. We know that racism is not a biological construct. It's man-made, it's a social construct. Dr. Kamara Phyllis Jones writes about the levels of racism. Anyone read any of her stuff? If not, I have a link up here for you. It is a really great read. I really encourage you to check it out. It compares the levels of racism to an allegory of a garden and how that impacts us. So let's look at institutionalized racism. I think we all have an idea of what this means, right? It's differential access to goods and services and opportunities of society by race. It's normative, it's sometimes legalized, and often manifests as inherited disadvantaged. It's structural. It's codified in our institutions of custom, into our legislation, into regulation. And it's often evident as inaction in the face of need. And institutional racism is about differential access to power and goods and materials. In terms of power, what we're talking about is differential access to information, being denied access to our own history or being denied the freedom to write our own history. Resources, wealth, we'll talk about that, differential access to that. And voice, differential access to voting rights, we've seen that in our history, and also representation in government. There's also differential access to materials, and those are the social determinants of health, like income, housing, employment, education. Any of you familiar with the Wellesley Institute? Yeah? Great. For those of you who are not familiar, the Wellesley Institute is a policy think tank here in Toronto, and they focus a lot of their work on health inequities. A few years ago, they did this amazing groundbreaking study. It was called Canada's Color-Coded Labor Market. And they looked at how racialized people are excluded from the labor market. And what they found was that for every dollar that a white man makes, a racialized man makes only 75.6 cents. And a racialized woman makes even less at 66.5 cents. When we think about the implications of that, that's huge, because we know as social workers the impact of income and poverty on mental health. So this realization that we're being excluded from the labor market and that impacts our health, that is huge. So the next piece is interpersonal racism. I think, we all know this. I'm not going to go into it in detail. But interpersonal acts, we can think of things like hate crimes, brutality, disrespect, and they're also subtle things like suspicion, clutching your purse when you walk by a racialized person, or avoidance, right? Avoiding sitting next to somebody who's racialized on the bus. It's a lot easier sometimes to identify the intentional acts and much harder to identify the unintentional acts. And a lot more research is now being done on what we call microaggressions. American psychologist Dr. Daryl Sue writes about microaggressions a lot. And microaggressions are the casual snubs, the insults, and the jokes that communicate a hidden message that you're different and you don't belong here. These messages can be verbal and nonverbal, intentional or unintentional, and are often communicated as innocent passing comments and gestures, and sometimes even as compliments. So these are comments like, "Oh, your English is so good," or "You're all so exotic," and "I couldn't even tell you were gay," or "Oh wow, you hide your addiction so well," or the one that I get all the time, "Hey Upala, where are you really from?" As if I possibly couldn't be from here. So over time, this institutional, interpersonal racism and microaggressions, they have an impact on us, and we begin to internalize this. Right? Internalized racism is accepting the negative messages about our own abilities and our own intrinsic worth. It's not believing in others that look like you and not believing in yourself, and accepting limitations of our own full humanity. Internalized racism, some examples of this, changing our appearance to look more mainstream, straightening our hair using skin bleaching cream, using racial slurs to describe ourselves, and rejecting our own history and our own cultures. Anyone here listen to Kanye West? Yeah? That's right, not anymore, thank you. So he was quoted just last week denying slavery, saying slavery was a choice. And when I heard this, the first thing I thought was, how deep is his internalized racism that he believes that slavery was a choice? So what's the impact of this on all of us? Whether it takes the form of overt discrimination or structural disadvantage, racism continues to influence how people are treated, what resources and jobs are available to us, where we are likely to live, how we perceive the world and our place in it, and what chances we have to reach our full potential. The anxiety, anger, and frustration from racist experience, they trigger the body's stress response, which over time creates wear and tear on the body's organs and systems. Lived experiences of racism can increase chronic stress levels and therefore worsen our health. Racism is trauma. Discrimination is trauma. When we think about racism, and we think about other forms of discrimination, they happen in moments, right? Whether it's an action, an act from another person, or whether we're facing a legislative barrier, a structural barrier, an organizational policy, they happen in these moments. And these moments have a direct impact on our health. A lot of researchers now are studying the impact of racism on health, and they're looking at the links between PTSD and racism-based traumatic stress. And so what I want to encourage us to do today is let's look at the way that we as social workers, the way that we assess trauma, and let's add a critical race lens to that. So first, there's the daily lived experience of trauma, right? And microaggressions. We talked about that already. Then there's the life stressors. So the particular racism-based life events, which are traumatic. And then we have chronic contextual stress. I think apartheid is a very clear example of chronic contextual stress. Then we have collective experiences. Genocide, the Holocaust, these are collective experiences which are very traumatic. Then we have intergenerational trauma, which in Canada we're all too familiar with the residential schools. And then there's vicarious trauma. vicarious racism is an all too real thing now because of social media, right? Twitter, Facebook. On a daily basis, we're exposed to live